Hi there, I'm Matthew Sheffield. This is Theory of Change. Thanks for being here. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind everybody that we're part of the Flux Media Network, so go to flux.community for more articles and podcasts about politics, religion, media, and society. So I appreciate everybody who is subscribing. You make the show possible, and I really appreciate it. So thanks very much. All right, so with that little preliminary out of the way, let us get into today's episode. After neoliberalism took over the Democratic Party in the 1990s, American politics shrank. We were no longer debating what the government should do for us, or even if it should do anything at all, for the most part. Instead, our politics focused on who are we, especially in regards to the question of who is American, who are we, and who do we want to be? These are questions that are old as time itself, and as people discovered there were other people who lived next to them who thought differently about important topics such as religion, especially. And so as a result, the taunt, go back to where you came from, is a taunt that is as old as humanity itself, probably. And even more depressingly, it's also an insult directed at people who were born in the United States themselves, who are not of white European ancestry. And so there are a lot of dynamics now in regards to that question. Even as our politics is opening up to people of more races and religions than before, many of these lingering resentments are still around. And so joining me to discuss some of this and how it impacted himself is Wajahat Ali. He is a columnist with the Daily Beast, and he is also, more importantly for this discussion, the author of a book called Go Back to Where You Came From, and other helpful recommendations on how to become an American, which is just out in paperback, so I encourage everybody to check that out. Welcome to Theory of Change, Waj.
Thank you, Matthew. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, so let's just give a little overview. Why don't you give it a little overview about the book and why did you write it?
So Go Back to Where You Came From is a love letter to a country that doesn't always love the rest of us back. It's about how you can fight for a country that oftentimes doesn't fight for you. And it's about this country called America, where many of us are, trying to achieve this thing called the American dream, even as we're living the nightmare, right? How do you feel when you're both us and them, a citizen and a perpetual suspect? And I use kind of my own journey as a personal through line for the viewer, just to step into my shoes or the shoes of those who I think they call us BIPOC now, Matthew, which means Black, Indigenous, and people of color, but sounds like, like a sleep apnea machine or like a Terminator sent from the future to kill us. But apparently that's what I'm the POC of BIPOC. But it's like, especially, the story of America from the perspective of those, especially Muslims and immigrants, and especially in the last 25 years, right? Ever since the war on terror, like, how did we experience this America, and how can we become the country that we sell to the rest of the world? And I hope in the end, the book makes the case or inspires you to keep fighting for that country and to keep stretching it and expanding it so all of our children can be its co-protagonists one day. And hopefully it's funny along the way.
Yeah. Well, I think it is. I think one thing that is clear, well, I guess that sometimes people, when they're talking about their book that I've looked at, is that they don't know that you are not actually an immigrant yourself. So talk about that. Maybe have you noticed other people sort of make that inference?
When I was first promoting the book on MSNBC, I think the producer gave Mika some wrong information. So right off the start of the interview, I felt bad for her. She's like, "So why did you come to this country?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm from California, but to some, New York is a foreign country. So the first time I came was 11 years ago, and she could tell she was embarrassed. So I didn't want to, it was an honest mistake. But there are folks who think that I wasn't born here, right? And I often get asked, "Well, when did you come here?" And I'm like, "From my mother's womb in 1980, the year of Empire Strikes Back." But sometimes it's sometimes the question isn't innocent. When you get told to go back to where you came from, even though you're born and raised in this country, much like if we remember Donald Trump when he was president, he told the squad, those 4 congresswomen of color, go back to your country first and clean it up and then come back. And he really fixated on Ilhan Omar. and then he was, in front of one of his many cult-like gatherings, and they chanted "Send her back" for 12 seconds. That, hit home for the rest of us, because even though those 4 women are citizens and congresswomen, and 3 of them were born and raised here, Matthew, it still wasn't enough. And that's the takeaway. No matter what you do, your citizenship or your belonging is conditional. It comes with an asterisk. So even if you were born here, and even if, you're a citizen, and even if you did everything right, but if you're not white, you are, quote unquote, a foreigner, an other, and a potential enemy. And I get told almost like every day, in some form or another, unsolicited recommendation, go back to where you came from. And I always ask, like, the Bay Area? I would love to if you could pay for my rent. What do you mean by that? And it's one of those situations where it's an ugly taunt. And last thing I'll say is, people forget that it wasn't just used against people of color, right? Irish, who are now considered white, weren't white, told to go back. Italians, Eastern European Jews, and Benjamin Franklin hated the Germans. So it's been like this. It's like herpes. It's been with America forever. This nativism and this xenophobia and this fear.
Yeah, and it is a human thing, unfortunately, because you do have that dynamic in pretty much every country, directed at people who are, not from the native stock, if you will. And these are they're things that I think people are now finally beginning to start discussing, but it's a discussion that's just really nascent at this point. And now do you? And at the same time, I think, you mentioned, this idea of BIPOC. A lot of people don't really like being lumped in with everybody like that, and so they see that type of designation also as sort of like maybe problematic on the other side of the equation. I mean, is that what you meant by that, or what's your
Well,
reaction?
it's just one of those situations where it's messy, right? Because apparently some people decide, okay, now you're the other, but then other folks who are allies say, no, we're BIPOC, and then a lot of people of color are like, what the f is BIPOC? I don't want to be BIPOC. What is? Am I like? Have I been sent from the future to kill you? It's just, it's interesting shifting terminologies and languages that we come up with. But even, race is an example of race. People sometimes forget that race itself is a social construct. Even white and black didn't exist until the 18th century, where rich, wealthy, white male landowners wanted to differentiate themselves from black folks, Native Americans, and poor whites. And that's where you see in American history the first actual, differentiation on paper between this thing called white and this thing called black. So it's a way that human beings have always been, in a strange way, tribal, and some groups have tried to assert their superiority, is through othering. I am not that. And in America, white supremacy has been tied to anti-blackness. Like, I am white because I'm not black, and anything that is pro-black is anti-white, right? And so if black people get their rights, that means it's coming at what? My expense. And you saw this play out in 2016, Matthew, when it wasn't economic anxiety, and the rest of us, the BIPOCs, kept trying to tell a lot of our colleagues, like, listen, just trust us on this. It isn't economic anxiety. It's mainly cultural anxiety that is driving Trump voters. They're like, no, because we can never use the R word racist, right? We have to go to the Rust Belt and listen to their grievances. And I'm like, trust me, they love him because he's racist. And then all the data has come out in the past 7 years. They're like, okay, yeah. So the main driver, not the only driver, is cultural anxiety. And when they dug through it repeatedly, it's this fear of being replaced, and that we can no longer achieve the American dream. It's being taken away from us by women, black people, Muslims, people of color, LGBTQ. And the irony is the rest of us who are on the wrong side of an advantage, we're like, I always joke about this. I was like, dude, if you only knew, we're not trying to replace you. We just want an invite to the party. Like, we want to eat this thing called meatloaf. We want to see if you guys wear shoes in your home. No one's trying to replace anyone, or at the very least, just leave us alone. Let us have our own barbecue. But, this is part and parcel of American history. You just see it play out again and again. It's like a reboot. It's like the Scream franchise. Every couple of years, they just add new characters, and there's a new villain. And so I think black has been the perpetual villain, but every once in a while they get replaced. I think right now it's drag queens and transgender, and about 10 years ago was Muslims.
Yeah. Well, and actually, let's talk about the Islam aspect of things, because I think that, a lot of the sort of right-wing messaging trends that we see now, they really did kind of develop in the aftermath of 9/11
Yeah.
with respect to, the so like I mean the Republican Party, the reactionaries who took it over, like they actually are not even the majority of the party. Like Republican voters, generally speaking, don't agree with their party on the issues. They don't want to, drastically shrink government. They don't want to cut Social Security. They don't want to. I mean, and a majority of them actually support same-sex marriage right now. And so, and obviously there are, a few points of agreement, but overwhelmingly the Republican, elite has a very different viewpoint of what government should do and what it should be. And actually, when I was at the Hill, I did polling for them, and we asked people about school prayer, and even Republicans didn't want it
Right.
mandatory in school. So, like, there's just a lot of things that they don't agree with their party on. But so, and in the Cold War, when they were able to use the USSR, Soviet Union as sort of this opponent, this other, and it was very effective for them to win elections. But after it was over, they needed to have another other. And so for a brief, a few, maybe what, 10 years or so, you
Mm.
can tell me what you think, but like it, for about 10 years or so, the other became Muslims.
Yeah.
And it didn't matter what what the Muslims said or who they are, what their beliefs were, as long as you were Muslim, you were other. And it didn't matter even if you were American for that matter.
I
Um,
would say 20 years. I would say even now, I'll say why 20 years is because if you look at Donald Trump, right, and you look at 2015, um, he realized, people forget this, it was actually Ben Carson who was the first one who kicked this off, Matthew, because Ben Carson said, will you have a Muslim in your cabinet member? He goes, only if they renounce Sharia. And then he repeated the BS manufactured talking points that literally came, I mean, I did the research on this, where did this come from? Obama is a Muslim. The radical Muslim Brotherhood has taken over America. Sharia is threatening to replace the Constitution, right? These were manufactured fears and boogeymen, much like CRT. It's the exact same playbook that came out from some right-wing think tanks that are funded by right-wing billionaires, and then they kind of seeded them out through the grassroots groups, mega churches, and then platformed it through local, national, and international media. And it literally, perfect sound bites, word for word, ended up in the mouths of politicians, especially before the 2010 midterm elections and the 2012 elections. So Ben Carson, who was running for president, said, I won't have a Muslim in my cabinet until he renounces Sharia, which is a totalitarian legal threat, that seeks to replace the Constitution. Now, everyone at that point was like, how dare he say that? Guess how the base responded? Huge spike in donations. People came out to, I think, his fundraiser that was in Cincinnati, huge social media engagement. And in November, I believe, of that year, a few weeks later, Donald Trump doubled down on it and said, okay, let me go on steroids and talk about a Muslim ban. And he was rewarded. So what really got like Donald Trump just raring with the base was calling Mexicans rapists and criminals, going after the undocumented, and the Muslim ban. And the first thing that he did, if you all remember, when with Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller did, the Nazi adjacent members of the GOP, I think, MAGA friendly. I'm being very diplomatic. They tried to bum rush that failed version of the Muslim ban. First thing, I remember when I went to cover a Trump rally. It was a few weeks before the election in Maine, and Rudy Giuliani was the headliner. And after a while, they weren't even talking about policies, Matthew, or like a speech. He just like started saying "lock her up," and there was like huge applause. Then he said "build a wall," huge applause. Muslim ban. And so when you saw it in person, you saw this rage, this anger against women, this anger against Muslims and immigrants. And I think with Ilhan Omar just a couple of weeks ago, right? Kevin McCarthy picked on Ilhan Omar of all people. They keep picking on her. And the question is why? It's because she is like this, call it like the trifecta, the hat trick, like the boogeyman that they constructed in their dreams. It's like Weird Science. I'm giving you an 80s pop culture reference where those two teenage boys in the John Hughes movie create the perfect girlfriend on a computer, Kelly LeBrock. If like Republicans could create their perfect villain, Ilhan Omar, black woman, formerly a refugee, but a Muslim who wears hijab, and on that canvas, they can create any type of terrifying story, which they do with Ilhan Omar. So I would say, even now, Muslim is the boogeyman, even though it's probably not number one right now. As we're talking, it's probably drag queens and transgenders, but it's become a very convenient top three boogeyman, which perfectly encapsulates everything we're saying: foreign, a threat, violent, not white, seeking to replace us, and something that we can easily create as a straw man to mobilize the base. And then, as you know, you bring in the Christian nationalist element of this, and that's just like fuel to the fire.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and speaking of the Christian nationalist aspect, one of the things that so when Donald Trump first came on the political scene in the Republican primary in like 2015, the people there were two groups of people that were his initial supporters, and they were actually self-identified liberal Republicans who
Mm-hmm.
remembered him as a New Yorker, who had been a Democrat and didn't like George W. Bush. So they were willing to give him a shot at first, and those people mostly are gone now.
Mm-hmm.
But so they were there in the beginning, but then the other ones who were there were people who identified as evangelical but did not actually go to church.
Hmm.
Uh, and so it's a fascinating dynamic because, and you kind of see that now things have slightly changed in terms of that his support does, it's a cross section of evangelicals, whether they attend or not. But, this idea that being a Christian is something about identity rather than action. And it's about who you are not rather than who you
That's
are.
exactly it. That's exactly it. It's almost like this desperate defense against modernism, right? And I saw it. I'm a practicing Muslim. You see within my communities also, and I always tell some Muslims, I say, you know who you all remind me of? And they're like, who? Christian nationalists, and they get so offended. Like, you remind me a lot of evangelical Christians, and I tell this to evangelical Christians, right? That the Jesus camp people. You guys will get along with some Muslims, and they're like, how dare you say that? Because religion is both a shield and a sword against modernity, and it has to do a lot with identity politics. It has to do a lot with what we are not. We are not you. We are not this. And it's, instead of expansion, it's almost like a constriction. Instead of expanding the TED, it's making the TED smaller and smaller. And the fear is that if we, and you know this, Matthew, you lived through this, if we expand the tent, the center will not hold. Everything will fall apart. Our daughters will become lesbians with, like, tattoos on their lower back. Our sons will become daughters. Everything that we've built will, like, end. And we will no longer have power. We will no longer have supremacy. And instead of trying a different model of engagement and openness and charity and kindness, it's replaced by fear and anxiety and loathing and self-loathing, right? And projection and hypocrisy and violence. And so that explains why so many of these individuals, right? Because so many people who don't come from religious backgrounds or have studied this or come from religious communities, like, I don't get it. Why are these people behaving in like, they're saying they're Christian, but they're not Christian? And I'm like, because Jesus is a mascot for them to validate all their fears, their paranoia, and their supremacy, right? And William Boykin, who used to be part of the George W. Bush's administration, I mean, he said he's a Christian nationalist. He's now on the right-wing talk circuit, but he said Jesus will return with an AR-15. Boebert has said something similar, right? So it's militant Jesus, right? They reject this whole saying of, like, the pacifist Jesus. They pick and choose the scripture, parts of the scripture that validate their white supremacy. And like with any group that is fundamentalist or extremist, that is motivated not by love or service, but by fear and hate, you get this Christian nationalist movement. And what's really terrifying about it is they believe they have, they're, like, to quote the Blues Brothers, we're on a mission from God. Their hate has a celestial stamp of approval with all that zealousness. And so that is, really a terrifying aspect of this white supremacy that we have always engaged with, that leads to xenophobia and anti-blackness and anti-Muslimness. But I know you talk about this, Matthew, but I feel like America still does not talk about the Christian nationalist aspect of white supremacy, especially with what we're dealing now with, what you call, the MAGA movement, that it's still not the majority of conservatives, but has nonetheless, like a virus, taken over.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. And with the parallels you were talking about with Islam, I mean, there's that famous meme of the white woman with her gun in her Bible, and then the Muslim woman who was, I guess she was a member of Hezbollah, and she had her gun and her Quran, and like, and it was funny because the white woman who was in that meme, she kept people knew who she was, and they were sending that meme to her. She was
Mm.
like, I don't get it. I don't get it. What's the comparison here?
And
Uh,
like you hear some people say American Taliban, you've heard Al Qaeda, you've heard white ISIS, because if you've studied this and if you've been through this, you know that the DNA is very similar. It's just the superficial, the wardrobe is different, but the DNA is very similar when it comes to violent extremists.
yeah, yeah. Well, and of course you see this in other parts of the world as well. Like I mean, in India, for instance, they've got a Hindu nationalist party that's trying to, well, that not just trying, but is actively discriminating against anyone who's not Hindu. And then, of course, in a lot of Islamic countries, they actively discriminate against non-Muslims, and but I guess what's kind of weird though is there is some kind of fungibility with regard to American right wingers and how they view the Islamic world now. So now they basically, through Donald Trump and Jared Kushner, now they've decided that they love Saudi Arabia. They can't get enough of them, and Saudi Arabia hasn't changed one bit, and it's since 9/11. And in fact, if they've gotten worse. You could argue in a lot of ways. I mean, they weren't conducting invasions of other countries at that point in time.
But look at Russia, man. We're old enough to remember. Like, I joked about this. If Ronald Reagan was to come back to life and find out that his party, praises Putin, he'd probably like just put me back in the grave and roll me over, right? It just goes to show you how white supremacy. It's malleable, it shifts, it adapts, evolves. I think Saudi Arabia is a fantastic example because even in the 2015 campaign, people forget that Donald Trump was hitting Hillary Clinton over Saudi Arabia. She made her return her money, and openly said these racist claims against Saudi Arabia. And then when it came to doing the tit for tat transaction, you go ahead and kill a U.S. journalist, Jamal Khashoggi, because you're good for business. And he actually ended up praising Mohammed bin Salman, the brutal crown prince of Saudi Arabia, basically the dictator, disavowed his own CIA and intelligence, disavowed Turkish intelligence, and praised his strength. And then Jared Kushner, and I have to mention this because you mentioned this, and people don't talk about it enough. A week before MBS consolidated his power, like Game of Thrones' Red Wedding, who was in Saudi Arabia? Jared Kushner. And MBS bragged that he has Jared Kushner, quote, in his back pocket. And the first trip that Donald Trump took to a foreign country was Saudi Arabia, where he does a curtsy in front of the king. And Jared Kushner somehow just gets a $2 billion loan from Saudi Arabia for his business. Matthew. So I guess it's all good when you're getting paid. All is fair.
Yeah, well, as long as you're a Republican. I mean, yeah, look, I mean, like Jared Kushner just himself, let alone Donald Trump and his, Saudi golf tournament stuff. Kushner himself, I mean, he makes Hunter Biden, look like a dollar store thief.
Yeah, he makes him look like a Boy Scout who was just caught once with his hand in the cookie jar.
Yeah, basically. All right, well, so let's maybe get into the book itself. So it's a memoir, and you're going through some of your experiences. What were some of the experiences that stand out to you that were some of your favorite to recount in the
Yeah,
book?
so it's like memoir-ish. It's
Yeah.
a different type of beast. And some people are like, I don't understand this book, the way it's structured, and that's deliberate, right? Like it's a memoir which takes a slight detour to commentary, which takes a slight detour to history, but hopefully it's weaved together in a entertaining enough narrative fashion that you go along for the ride. And overwhelmingly, the response has been excellent, so I'm very pleased with that. But that's the question: is how do you fit a life into 235 pages? Because I wanted to make it nice and tight for readers. What do you choose to highlight? What do you choose to not highlight? And so, some of the things that I focused on were the first part was the origin story. Just so before we get to the heavy stuff, people can step in my shoes. Growing up, a brown-skinned kid in the Bay Area where my parents thought it'd be hilarious not to teach me English. So I only knew 3 phrases of English when they dropped me off at preschool. I learned English at the age of 5, and English as a second language in first grade. I was a fat kid in the 80s, Matthew, when there was no Dove soap commercials about body positivity. There was no Lizzo. If you were a fat kid growing up in the 80s and 90s, you remember that there were only two types of kids back in the day, normal kids and fat kids. And every day was World War III. So the trauma of wearing husky pants. I'm left-handed, the only left-handed person in my family, and you learn what that means if you're Asian and left-handed. So basically, it's about that fish out of water, and how this fish out of water goes to school, and that's where you learn your place in the American hierarchy. School is oftentimes when I ask people, when I give speeches and presentations, when you ask a lot of folks who are immigrants and people of color, like, when was the first time you got hit with like a racist statement? The age that they come back to me with, Matthew, is 5 and 6. School. That's where you learn. Oh, I'm a sidekick. I'm a villain. I don't belong. My people aren't in the history books. And like, how does that shape you? So in response to that, people like us and people like me, especially, were desperately looking for heroes because I consumed pop culture and stories. And so that leads me on this journey to create stories with me and my friend. And that kind of leads to this chapter where I talk about exactly what you and I have just discussed is, why do so many Americans in the 21st century have this archaic view of Muslims when we also have, like, Muhammad Ali and Ilhan Omar and all these Muslim cab drivers and teachers and educators? But when it comes to Muslims, you don't see me, Matthew. You see Osama and ISIS. So I talk about it, like why America has a relationship thanks to politics, history, and media. And then I focus on how I try to change that. And then the crisis, if you will, the plot twist in the book, which then takes on a different trajectory, is 9/11, which I call this crisis in the timeline, right? There's always a pre-9/11 and a post-9/11. And for me, I was 21 years old, a senior at UC Berkeley, Pakistani Muslim American man, about to graduate, and then 9/11 happens. And ever since that moment, it's the post-9/11 world where I have to defend 1.7 billion people and 1,400 years of Islamic civilization and prove my patriotism, and how it feels, right, from overnight being like this suburban Muslim kid who was the good minority to overnight becoming the villain. And the second plot twist, which I talk about more in the book, is a few months after 9/11. I grew up middle class, upper middle class, suburban kid, and then my parents both get arrested. And overnight, I'm living the American dream and the American nightmare. Overnight, we lose everything. And overnight, I become the bad minority, lose the credit, lose the money, lose the home. And now I have both parents in jail. I'm the only child. I have to leave school and take care of my grandmothers. And then I see another version of America and Americans, the one that is oftentimes marginalized and mocked, right? The poor, the people of color, the ones who are lazy, the ones who are in jail. And so my experiences, I believe, have given me a very expansive and panoramic view of this country called America. And then I try to give you some of my recommendations about how you can still have some hope and fight for the country you want this country to become. So I hope I gave you a Cliff Notes without too many spoilers.
Yeah. Well, one thing that you talk about, or aspect of your growing up, is like you kind of are realizing when you're going through puberty, talking about putting pictures of beautiful women on the wall, that you're, I guess you're kind of navigating between what the sort of Americanized commercial uh, you know sexual dynamic that people are, I don't know, accustomed to, or surrounded with, and then sort of the traditional Muslim dynamic as well. And there's some tension there, and you resolve. I mean, let's talk about that a little
Yeah,
bit.
see, that's interesting. I'm glad you're the first person that brought that up, and I think it's because of your religious background. You understand what it's like to come from a practicing religious family, right? Because we are practicing, but people see us and they think, oh, my mom doesn't wear hijab, my father doesn't have a beard, and with me, with my life, what I do, people assume that I'm quote unquote secular, which means good Muslim, by the way. Secular means safe Muslim, neutered Muslim, the Muslim who drinks alcohol. And once they realize I don't drink alcohol, I'm practicing, it's always fascinating, even in liberal circles, to see them just like, they don't know what to do with me. Because to them, religious people are like, I always joke, you're either a carnivore or like vegan. And I'm like, most people are actually like omnivores. It's like a mix and match, right? Like you can believe but not be too religious, or you can be religious about a few things, but we just don't understand religion. We don't talk about it well in this country, which is hilarious because it's such a oddly religious country. So there is this scene I have in the book where, it's puberty. I'm like 13 or 14, 13 years old. And I remember it was like the 90s. And I don't know, like all of a sudden you see girls. And my mom used to have these magazines, like these Vogue magazines. And there were the supermodels back in the day. And the supermodels used to be Cindy Crawford, Naomi Campbell, Claudia Schiffer, Linda Evangelista, and a few others. A heyday. It was glorious times, Matthew. And so for whatever reason, I'm like, ooh, women, pretty. And I just put these photos up on my wall one day. My mom comes up and she goes like, what the hell is this? This is disgusting. Oh my God. Wait till your father comes home. Keep those photos up. Let's see what your dad says. And I'm all of a sudden like embarrassed. And my dad comes and he's tired. He comes from work and my mom says, look at this. And my father sees these women on the wall. And I swear to God, I see him smile. Then he catches his smile, eats it, and it goes, it's fine, Samina. My mom's name is Samina, and my mom's like, what? And he goes, it's just let him have it. And you kind of, in hindsight, you realize, oh yeah, your dad was once a teenage boy. And the second thing, which is an un-PC thing to say, but I think is an accurate thing to say for many dads, is like secretly, I think a lot of dads, even though hopefully we've gotten better about this, are like, oh, my son's straight. He likes girls. Phew. So it was just one of those situations where it was like you assume in this traditional Muslim family, you don't do that. But then you also realize Muslims, Mormons, Jews, Hindus, there's boys who go through puberty. Like sex is normal, but we kind of have made it so abnormal, and we've made it like a source of so much guilt and so much sexual repression across all these religious traditions, Matthew, that it does such a damage to men and women and relationships, right? Where I was very lucky, and I mentioned this in the book also, is that my parents, from that moment on, you kind of saw that there was an opening where, oh, I could talk to them about this stuff and it's not something that's dirty. Does that make sense? And that's where I was very lucky compared to a lot of my friends where, believe it or not, born and raised in America within these religious families, not once have their parents ever talked to them about girls. And it did have an impact on their relationships and their marriages. Because instead of sex being seen something as, just normal and awkward and weird, and you learn through it, it's seen as something shameful and evil. And the joke, I think I mentioned in this book, the joke was, puberty, you go through, like, let's say 13. All right, don't touch a girl. Don't have sex with any girl until you get married. If you do, you go to hell. And then you fast forward, you're 30 years old. What the hell's wrong with you? How come you're not married? And you're like, wait, what? And so these are things that I think if you grow up in some religious communities across the board, I found that a lot of folks who read the book, they're like, oh, we have that dysfunction as well.
Yeah. Well, and it is very relatable. I mean, like in the Mormon community that I was born and raised in, they have that exact same dynamic. You're supposed to go from 0 to 100 without any instruction,
without a seatbelt, without any instruction, without a driver's license,
and without having gone to 20 or 30.
And it's your fault, right? And then the funny thing is, people don't realize, and this, you know what, it goes back to what we were saying, almost the hypocrisy. Because human beings are just human beings. We live our life. It doesn't matter. So it's like you can't tell people, oh, don't stop being sexual. It just doesn't work. Be abstinent. And then you find out all these stories. Same thing with Mormons. I know this because I have Mormon friends. Same thing happens. And then you find out later people are having sex. People make mistakes. Then people feel so guilty. And people feel so ashamed. It messes up their relationship with God. It often then manifests itself through misogyny, Matthew. And then women themselves are blamed, being impure, and the men then get kind of like get off scot-free. And then due to these double standards, right, then the men who are out having sex with all these women, then they want a pure wife. And then I'm like, what do you mean pure wife? You're the one who's having sex. It just leads to so much, you know this, it leads to so much self-hate, confusion, loathing, pain, dysfunction, misogyny. And you sit there and go, gosh, if you just had a normal conversation, if you had sex ed, if you had body positivity, it would, and you could still be religious about it, and you could actually introduce a loving, forgiving God who says, you know what, people make mistakes, it's okay. Just because you did this doesn't mean you have to be that. And you could, it's normal, and people do this, and you don't have to hate yourself for the other gender. And talk to me about it. And guess what, your parents and uncles did the same thing. It's normal. They're like, what? We never knew that. Like, we were just like, everyone's a Spartan. No one has sex or sexual thoughts and feelings. And if you F up, you sit there and cry and feel guilty, and you promise never to do it again, but then you do it again, which increases the self-loathing. And then you get to the age of 28, 29, 30, and your elders who told you that you'd go to hell if you touch a girl, now they're on your back for not getting married. And you're like, but you didn't even tell me how to date girls and talk to girls. They're like, what? You should have learned that. I'm like, where? You
From
told me not
who?
to watch those movies or take sex ed. So I feel like this is where a lot of Mormons, a lot of Muslims, a lot of Christians who grew up in these communities, even though thank God my parents weren't like this. And that's why I mentioned that section in the book. And I'm glad you picked up on that, because I wanted to offer a different path for religious communities. And something which was funny as well. It's one of those situations that I think people will be like, oh, we can do this better.
Yeah, and another aspect that I thought was notable is that so in having a book that you're trying to present as broad of a picture of your own experience. You talk about in your involvement and with the play,
Mm.
and that some people that were Muslim, that they had this idea that all depictions have to be positive, and otherwise, because they feel like that it just has to be that way because it will encourage discrimination, or what, they have a variety of reasons. But the reality, as you kind of discuss it in the book, is that if we don't show everyone that we have both negative aspects of and positive aspects, that it's harder to be seen as human if every single depiction is this amazing, beautiful, handsome, smartest ever person.
With white
That's
teeth,
not real.
pay your
Yeah.
taxes, no mistakes, there's no racism, there's no sexism, we're good, we are religious. And it's you can understand. So for folks who are listening, why is the impulse there for so many immigrant communities, marginalized communities, to present the best foot forward, is because you realize you rarely get a chance to do a counter narrative. And so in that counter narrative, you want to present yourself in the best light possible to wash away the hundreds of years of ugly narratives. And so maybe people see you and accept you and like you. But like you said, and I mentioned this in the book, is for an audience, you're like, nah, that's a fraud. I don't buy it. And instead of normalizing us, it seems like, they're lying. They're doing takia. They're just trying to sell us a lump of coal and calling it gold, right? It doesn't resonate. It doesn't connect emotionally with audiences. It's not real. What I've seen is that if you show a real portrait, a nuanced portrait, the audience respects that more. Like this, especially nowadays, right? Where misinformation, disinformation is so common. What are people striving for? What are people yearning for, Matthew? Authenticity. Just be real with me. Just be honest with me. And I feel like that type of honest, authentic narrative, showing the warts, like we mentioned, even about sex, something funny as silly as that, they're like, I can relate to that. That is honest. Even though that's not my journey, at least this person is being vulnerable and real. And writing this book, I get that compliment, I guess, a lot. People are like, wow, you were so vulnerable. You put it all out there. Were you trying to be vulnerable? I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I was just trying to be honest. Because you write a book like this, you have to put it all out there, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Because if I didn't, I would be doing a disservice to the story, and the book would not have been as successful or resonating, I think, with audiences. So what people compliment me for, this vulnerability, I'm like, I didn't sit there and be like, I will be vulnerable and I will get compliments. I was just trying to be honest. And that type of honesty, which reveals messiness, because we're human beings, we're messy creatures. That's, Matthew, what resonates with people, and in a strange way, humanizes a community that has been demonized for so long.
Yeah, and it's like people who support discriminatory policies, they often will use tokens as, well, look, see, here's a Muslim who agrees with us. Here's Candace Owens, who's Black, who agrees with us.
Excellent use of Candace Owens. Yes.
But it's like, so, but on the other hand, people who are against the discrimination, they also are, there's the temptation to, in line with what we're talking about here, to tokenize, but in a positive direction as well. Neither one of these tokenizing of people work, because people are people, and they're not, your sort of political avatar to move around on the chessboard.
I would say politically, the tokenization of some works, right? And let me what I mean by that, but in a devious way. So the cultural validators is what I call them, right? It's like a marionette puppet. Instead of you saying it, you can have a Candace Owens, an articulate Black woman, saying it. See, I'm not racist. How can I be racist when the Black woman Candace Owens is saying everything? I'm not racist. Larry Elders is saying it. I'm not racist. Dinesh D'Souza is saying it. I'm not racist. Nikki Haley is saying it. And this has been a tried and tested strategy, especially of white supremacy in America, is you get these tokens from every ethnicity group, and you have them say your talking points, and it's almost like money laundering, right? It's like washing away your racism through this mannequin of color. And it's a two-way street. Candace Owens is a smart woman. She's not dumb. She knows the grift. Dinesh D'Souza, I believe, is a true believer, but he knows the grift. And we always joke, especially a lot of my friends who do the work that I do, like, man, we could make a lot of money if we just promoted right-wing talking points. Like, I could be a millionaire overnight. I know exactly what to say. I'd get on the right-wing circuit. The multimillionaires would love me. I would just crush it on Fox News, but I would have to give up my soul and maybe go to hell. But man, on Earth, I would be a millionaire. So, I just joke with my wife. I'm like, listen, you want me to like get our retirement money and subsidize our kids' colleges? You want me to just become a right winger? She goes, very tempting, but no, just don't do it. So it is unfortunately successful, but for all the wrong reasons, Matthew.
Yeah. Well, and I had that experience in my own life, having worked in right-wing politics. I mean, there's a phrase, when I was a conservative, I would sometimes hear liberals refer to this idea of a wingnut welfare. And I just scoffed at it. I was like, that's not real. There's no such thing. But once I left the right, then I realized, oh my God, it's so much more competitive. There's so many more people here, and there are no, sugar daddies out there. I mean, for George Soros isn't, he didn't mail me a check as soon as I decided I didn't want to be
that's what people don't realize. I would love for this deep state conspiracy to be true sometimes, because we're not getting paid. Whereas, as as a member of this right-wing culture war, where you were a foot soldier, the money is there in the right wing. That's what people don't realize. Like it's a few, but they are deeply committed. And it's a lucrative grift, especially if you're a person of color, and you want to go along with this grift. You have a job for life, even though you do so much damage to not just your communities, but to America, because you become an enforcer of white supremacy, Matthew. That's what happens. And what also happens, especially when it comes to immigrants, is you promote this toxic narrative that I mentioned in the book called The Model Minority. We are the good minorities. We don't rock the boat. We row the boat. Here's our white teeth. We're smiling. We're shiny. We're happy. We work hard. We achieve the American dream. What racism? Look at all you darkies who are whining and complaining. Pick yourself up from the bootstraps, right? Work hard like I did. And then in this narrative, conveniently, you just don't mention any of the privileges, any of the luck, any of the money, and you completely flatten the experiences of all these folks who, perhaps through no fault of their own, just are stuck in a cycle of pain and suffering and poverty, and don't get tax cuts like the 1% when the Republicans come in power. So it's really so insidious. And the right wing has really kind of created this laboratory that just manufactures them for almost like of every ethnicity. And the type of damage that these validators and tokens do is man, it just does a number on the rest of us.
Yeah. Well, and now another aspect, and you do kind of talk about this also, but one of the less discussed things about Muslims in America is that Muslims used to be Republican. For a long time, they leaned Republican, and that transition happened, while you were coming of age. Talk about that a little bit, if you could, please.
So I give one particular example, which is deeply painful. It, is that in the 2000 election, all right, the contentious 2000 election between George W. Bush and Gore, many Muslims, like my parents' generation in particular, Asian and South Asian Arab immigrant, decide to vote as a Muslim bloc. They said, "Oh, there's enough of us. We've achieved the American dream. We live in a lot of battleground states, and let's come together as a quote unquote bloc." Now, it's important that a lot of Black Muslims, because about a third of Muslims in America are Black or from African countries, they said, "Nah, we're gonna vote Democrat." Right? You guys are wrong. Don't do this. That was my first election where I could vote, and I begged some of these folks in my communities in California. I said, "Please don't do this. Why are you doing this?" Right? And to be honest, they said the following: uh, "It's a Muslim bloc vote. Republicans believe in God and family values. Uh, Lieberman was the vice presidential candidate for Gore, and this, even though this wasn't the top two concern, I'll be honest with you. Some people said he's a hardcore Zionist. He'll help Israel, and I'm like, what are you talking about? America helps Israel. It's like AIPAC, the lobby. Plus he's the vice president. And then this is important. Democrats learned this the hard way. Republicans, through Grover Norquist, courted Muslims for the first time. Grover Norquist, who is a right-wing conservative, wants to do away with the taxes in D.C., influential. He went to Bush and he said, "I think we can win over Muslims." He's married to a Muslim woman, a Muslim Palestinian woman. And Bush actually met with Muslims, repeated some of their talking points. And so if you've never, the analogy I give, Matthew, is if you've never been asked to the prom and someone flirts with you, and you're like, "Oh, I like this person. I'm going to go to the prom with them." And so a lot of these folks were then enamored by Bush. And then also, let's not forget that Clinton was coming off that scandal, which did, sour some people, right? And Bush very smartly ran on, restoring family values, restoring integrity and dignity to the White House. I'm talking about, of course, Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton. You take all that together and you go to Florida, where there were two states in particular where Muslims like really kind of came together to do this block vote, California and Florida. Grover Norquist crowed that if it was not for the Muslim vote, George Bush would not have won, because 90% of registered Muslim voters in Florida went for Bush, and Bush won that state by just 500 plus votes. And the Schadenfreude, the great irony, the tragedy is Bush comes in, and what happens, Matthew? War and terror against Muslims.
Yep. Yeah. Well, and it's so things flip back. The Muslims flip back to Democrats, or flipped over to Democrats
in 2008, especially.
Yeah, and but now I guess there is, maybe some people are thinking about coming back in relation to this renewed Republican effort against affirmative action programs. Particularly, they're reaching out to Asian Americans of all different races and saying, "Look, you guys are discriminated against. We are going to protect you by ending affirmative action." And some people seem to be a little bit persuaded by it. There's this incel forum out there called Asian Masculinity Forum that, it's being they're being pushed toward the right, not just through misogyny, but also through that they feel like that Republicans will stand up for them more.
It's not just, I wrote about this recently. I've been covering it. I've been trying to warn people for a long time. I wrote about Andrew Tate in particular for MSNBC last month. And specifically, I've been trying to warn folks in my communities that you're not paying attention to this type of misinformation, conspiracy theories, especially through social media, of this toxic masculinity that is going to win over not just young men, but a lot of suburban men who feel, quote unquote, emasculated. Men can't be men anymore. Feminism has gone too far, and now this gay stuff is too much. And I always ask them, I said, "What do you mean feminism has gone too far?" It's just gone too far. Like, I'm like, what do you mean men can't be men, right? And so if you look at white supremacy, not just talk about patriarchy, power, right? Regardless of who wields it, regardless of whatever their identity is often blind to its own abuses. And for those who are in power, equality always looks like oppression. And so there's so many men, suburban men, educated men, and young men who are now easily swayed by what I call like this. I don't know if you've seen Magnolia, that Tom Cruise character, Frank Mackey, who, he's like, respect the, I can't say it on your show, but he comes in and like sells men this angry, male who just takes women and takes what he wants, and he thumps his chest, and he's not a beta cuck, he's an alpha male. And like, it's a caricature. That caricature has now come to life in the form of Andrew Tate and other folks, and also Donald Trump in a way, this toxic masculinity where you just grab them by the pee. And it has the power to not just radicalize, Matthew, but win over some suburban male voters on this issue alone. And it's one thing where I feel like Democrats just don't like get on top of it. I'm in Virginia, and I told them, I said, man, CRT, you're not going to counter it. It's going to win over some suburban parents. And it did with Youngkin. They're like, we'll ignore it. I'm like, don't ignore it. I'm telling you, in the suburbs, what I'm hearing is the following. This gay stuff has gone too far. Oh, they're making our boys into girls. And so this is where Republicans are really good at creating these manufactured boogeymen of like CRT and other stuff, and really preying upon insecurities and fears. And I think they're going to win over more men that they realize, and I think they're going to win over more religious communities than they realize. And a failure, and I think you might agree with me on this, the failure of Democrats, some Democrats, is I'm like, if you just were to lean into religious communities, use some religious language, and broaden the tent, you will win over some of these voters. And this is where I think Biden being a Catholic actually helps. And another person who does it really well is Buttigieg. You don't have to be like full on nationalist, celebrate the fact that it's a secular country as well, separation of church and state. But if you're completely going to abandon it, not address it, mock them, ridicule it, you're ceding the ground to Republicans who know how to use the language and really capitalize on the fears. And this is where the fear of feminism and LGBTQ will work over men, and will work over some religious communities and suburban communities that I hope they can counter in 2024. I don't know if you agree or disagree with me.
Yeah, well, I do agree with you. And in fact, like if you look at 2020, vote totals for Donald Trump across racial groups, he lost support among white voters. He gained support among Black voters and among Hispanic, and I believe among Asian as well. And a lot of it does.
Those men, you saw some of those men go towards him.
Yeah, well, and so a lot, yeah, and to your point that for a lot of people who are, let's say they have always been secular or non-religious or whatever, like to them, religion is just irrelevant. It's all stupid, it's all dumb, and so the grandmother who goes to mass on Sunday, she's just as wrong and a threat to society as some guy who goes into the backwoods and trains for a Christian militia. Like to them, there's no difference between those two people. And yeah, it's horrible, and it's really dumb, and it's patronizing, and it's very naive at the same time.
Well, I just want to say, bringing back full circle, it's what we were discussing, where if you only see religious people as as carnivores and vegans, you're missing out on the big middle. And I want to give a response to how you can fight back without compromising your values or catering to cruelty. Mallory McMorrow, who's now kind of this rising young superstar from Michigan, she got hit last year with these groomer allegations, right? And the strategy last year, Matthew, of Democrats just infuriate me sometimes, was don't respond to the groomer allegation, because apparently that's how you win a fight, by not fighting. And so Mallory McMorrow got so pissed off because her Republican colleagues were calling her groomer, like a pedophile. And specifically, on top of calling her groomer and pedophile, they were attacking teachers and LGBTQ kids, right? This is going to result in violence, folks. People don't realize that the end result of these conspiracy theories is going to be violence against not just the LGBTQ, but educators and doctors. There's death threats against Boston Children's Hospital. And so Mallory McMurrow decides to respond to it, but this is smart. She responds to it as a self-identified white Catholic mother. And she leans into her Catholic values and says, my religion and values have taught me not to hate and demonize, especially those who are marginalized. This is how you craft a counter message where you hold on to your values and beliefs. You don't have to agree with everything, but you say, yeah, you're right. Just because I disagree with this or I might be afraid of it doesn't give me the license to be cruel and vicious. And this is where Matthew, by not talking down, but talking to folks, especially religious communities and with some religious coloring, if you will, you win over voters. You win over voters and you blunt this Republican hateful attack and you call it out for the hateful attack that it is. And I feel like you and me, because you come from the Mormon community and I come from the Muslim community, and because you've been active as a right-wing cultural warrior, and I've been active as a writer and commentator, and we've gone across America, we realize that people don't say out loud what they're really feeling. The conversation on WhatsApp is different from the conversation that people have publicly. But nonetheless, these conversations are happening. These fears are being expressed. These fears then get capitalized on by the GOP, especially around sex and women and kids and LGBTQ. And then it leads to, how the heck did all these people vote for Republican? And you and me are like, no shit, we told you. And I just feel like if Democrats were able to lean in with that type of religious language a little bit that Buttigieg and Biden do, it might be a wrap. They can win over a bunch of folks, especially as MAGA is going further and further extreme and violent and hateful.
Yeah, well, and also ramp up the economic policies that are designed to help people lift them up, because like reactionary politics isn't about solving problems. It's about it's about manipulating the masses.
That's right.
To support the leader who doesn't actually care about them. And so, when you combine a more solicitous but still pro tolerance message that also says, look, we're the ones who are actually taking care of you. Your party
That's it.
betrayed you. You guys feel left behind. There's nothing wrong with that. You were left behind, but it was your party who did it.
I was going to write an article today where the reports are finally coming. I wrote about this last. That's the thing. I should be wrong about everything, which if I was wrong about everything, I'd probably get paid more. But unfortunately, I was right. Everything that there's Biden Democrats are doing about Social Security, I said, for the love of God, can you please do this in the summer? And now the reports have come out that Biden and now Democrats have realized that by uniting Americans around the common enemy, which is the Republicans, and saying, hey, they're taking away stuff from you. We're giving you stuff. They're taking away Social Security. We want to give it to you. They're taking away Medicare. We want to give it to you. They're banning books. We want more books. They're taking away rights. We want to give you rights. You win over folks. You win over religious folks, black folks, white folks. You win over some Republicans even. But you have to identify the common enemy and attack them. And this is where I think Democrats sometimes fail. And it's one of those situations where even if you're not a Democrat and you hate both parties, you realize, you know what? Right now, women losing their rights and this ugliness and attacking kids and attacking immigrants and, grabbing women by the feet. It's just, this is too much. And this is ugly. And there's enough religious people out there. I can tell you, for those who are listening, who are disgusted by it. Sometimes they just need an invite. Sometimes you just need an invite. That's it. That's all I'm saying. And it goes back full circle. We don't want to replace you. We just want to invite to the party. And if you invite us to the party, we'll bring our biryani next to your meatloaf, and you'll be very happy. Trust me.
All right. Well, that's a good way to end it there. Let me put the book up on the screen again. So we've been speaking today with Wajahat Ali. He's the author of Go Back to Where You Came From and other helpful recommendations on how to become American. And you're on Twitter at Wajahat Ali. So that's WAJAHATALI. So thanks for being here.
Thanks, Matthew. That hour flew by fast. I really appreciate it. And thanks for what you're doing.
All right, great. Glad to have you. All right, that's our program for today. I appreciate you joining us for the discussion. And since you are a subscriber, you got to see the whole thing, and I really appreciate your support. We really need it. We're not subsidized by any billionaires or publishing companies or nonprofits or universities. We are subsidized and paid for by you. You guys make this possible. So I really appreciate your help. Thanks very much.